All right, all you cool cats and kittens out there. Gonna be just finishing up our notes for today. Just our last section, just going over the different major categories of living things. So far, we've already talked about the Linnaean system of classification, how that works, what it's based on, like the physical characteristics stuff, uh, why they needed that kind of system. After that, in our second section of notes, we talked about the cladograms and how we now base everything on evolutionary relationships. So we look at how things are related to one another, as far as like their genetics are concerned, as far as like the development of their different physical characteristics. So today we're going to be finishing up looking at the six kingdoms and the domains that they're in. If you remember, domain is the most inclusive division of living thing. Kingdom's right underneath that, so it gets a little bit more specific. So, this next one, 18-3, Kingdoms and Domains, there are now six kingdoms of living things. We've got plants and animals they knew about originally, like that's Linnaeus knew that, but they didn't really know about like the single-celled stuff. Later in the 1800s, they discovered protista, which were protists like slime molds and plankton, stuff like that. 1950s, they finally discovered, hey, there's little single-celled organisms called bacteria, protist, and then they also had fungi. So fungi and protist were different things, and we'll talk about what makes them different here in a little bit. And finally, in the 1990s, they separated out the different types of bacteria. So Monera, which was originally just all the single-celled organisms, all the prokaryotes lumped together, they eventually found, oh, there are some actually major differences between different types of bacteria, and we'll look at what those are today too. So, the domain is the most inclusive taxonomic category, and it is larger than a kingdom. Before we get into the actual kingdoms, we're going to look at the domains first. So you look here, we've got bacteria, we've got archaea, which is archaea bacteria, and we've got eukarya. We're going to spend more time on eukarya. We also need to look at this. Now, something similar to this chart is also in the homework sheet that I had for you guys today, one of the assignments. We'll look at that tomorrow, and I'll go through and work through it with you guys. So have no fear if you're looking at it and you're like, I don't know what the heck's going on here. We will kind of go through that together, and I can walk you through it. So let's look at our first of three domains, the eubacteria. Eubacteria, these are prokaryotes. They're little single-celled things. They're everywhere. So they're unicellular, they're prokaryotic, and they can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. Autotroph means it makes its own food. Heterotroph means it has to eat something else. Hetero means other. Troph talks about eater. So other eater, basically. And these eubacteria also have cell walls, and the particular chemical in their cell wall that allows it to like be a little bit more stiff is called peptidoglycan. You don't really need to know that, but you do kind of need to know that they have cell walls. So eubacteria, normal bacteria, that's going to be, they're unicellular, they're prokaryotes. They can be autotrophic or heterotrophic, and they have cell walls. Some examples down there, E. coli, which is, well, actually E. coli and streptococcus. Both things that can cause you to feel sick to your stomach. E. coli is food poisoning, or not really food poisoning, but it's something caused similar to food poisoning. Salmonella is food poisoning, but that's another bacteria. Strep, I'm sure you've all had like a strep infection before. Comes on suddenly, you get really sick, you end up throwing up through the night, sore throat, that kind of stuff. And staph infection, it's a staphylococcus, which has to do with the shape of the bacteria itself. Those are generally going to be happening in places like hospitals. So it's really common in hospital to get a staph infection, just from, a bunch of sick people being around one another. So eubacteria, they're everywhere. You find them in the ocean, you find them in the soil, you find them in the air, you find them on your skin, you find them in your body. They're everywhere, completely surrounding us all the time. Archaeobacteria, which is our second domain, those are a little bit more specialized, I would say. So they are very specific to certain areas. And there's one major characteristic about areas where you can find these archaeobacteria. They are extreme. Archaeobacteria are known as extremophiles, meaning they live in environments where normally other living things could not survive. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But let's look at some of the basic characteristics. They are unicellular, so they're made of one cell. They are prokaryotes, so they're one cell. They're made just like prokaryotes. The extreme environment. So what are some examples of extreme environments that you're going to find them? One is a volcanic hot spring, a place where you basically have temperatures of like boiling water, extremely hot. Most things would not be able to live. They're going to be boiled alive. But these archaeobacteria thrive there where nothing else can survive. Brine pools. Brine means it's really salty. So extremely salty areas. If you've ever, I guess you've been to the ocean. But if you know the Dead Sea, it's over in close to Israel or in Israel. The Dead Sea is so salty that nothing can live in it. There's no fish. You don't find any organisms. However, you could find archaeobacteria. So generally, if something's really salty, the organisms are going to die. Basically, they just get dehydrated. It sucks the moisture right out of them. But these archaeobacteria, they not only thrive there, or they not only survive there, they thrive there. That's where they need to be. And they can survive in black organic mud, totally devoid of oxygen. So they don't necessarily need oxygen to survive. In fact, there's a whole class of archaeobacteria like methanophiles, where they actually eat. They're like chemoautotrophs. So they make their food by just breaking down certain substances like volcanic gases. So they don't actually need oxygen to be able to survive at all. Some of the earliest forms of life didn't actually need oxygen either. So that's probably the leftovers from that time in Earth's history. So archaeobacteria, they can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. Like I kind of talked about the chemoautotroph there, the ones that break down like methane and stuff. Those would be autotrophs. So they're making their own food. Or they could be other eaters. They could get their food from eating something, from breaking other things down. And lastly, they do have cell walls, but they don't have peptidoglycan. Really, all I want you to know, eubacteria, archaeobacteria, both of those do have cell walls. But those cell walls are not like the cell walls that we're going to talk about here in a bit. So those are the single-celled organisms. Those are the prokaryotes. Domain eukarya, if you look back up here, we've got our domains of eukarya. Eukarya means they are eukaryote cells, right? So they're more complex, they're larger, they've got membrane-bound organelles. These are going to be the multi-celled organisms. So let's look at our specific kingdoms. First, and some of the earliest forms of complex life that formed on Earth is Kingdom Protista. Protists, they're eukaryotic, kind of why they're in eukarya. You see the greatest variety in the types of protists that you see. And I'll kind of explain that here in a little bit. Most of these protists are single-celled, and some of them are multicellular, but they're not going to have like different tissues or anything. They're going to be very simple multicellular, like a kind of like a little bunch of cells stuck together. They can be photosynthetic. They can be heterotrophic. They're just like the bacteria in that way. They can make their own food. They might eat something else. It really just depends on each individual protist. Some examples: kelp, amoebas, which amoebas is misspelled there. There you go. A slime mold, Paramecium, euglena. There's all these like tiny little organisms like plankton out in the ocean. If you've ever heard of plankton, like whales, they'll go and they'll just kind of like swim through the ocean and just eat like in mass quantities all of this plankton, and that's where they get their energy from, and that's how they grow so large, because all this plankton's everywhere. But protists, they can have characteristics of all of the other three things that we're going to talk about. Some of them behave like a fungus. Some of them behave like a plant. Some of them behave like animals. It really just, they're as unique as the different other kingdoms, and it depends on each individual thing. So let's look at some examples of protists, what they look like. This would be like a simple multicellular one. There's not really a whole lot to them. Kelp is an example. It looks like a plant, but it's not. It's just a big bundle of cells. It's very simple. There's no tissue to them. They don't really need any tissue. Obviously, they are photosynthetic, so they're making their own food. Little single-celled things, simple multicellular, single-celled amoebas and stuff and whatnot. So hopefully you kind of get the picture there. They're just going to be very simple. There's no tissue. There's no organs or anything like that. They're just very simple little eukaryote cells. Fungi is next. Hopefully you guys know a little bit something about fungus, like mushrooms and things like that. But fungi, they are heterotrophic, meaning they have to eat things. And for the most part, fungi are going to be decomposers. That's what they do. Some of them are parasitic, so they'll actually like live on things, like a ringworm. That'd be a parasite. That would be an example of a fungus. So basically what fungi do is they, like a spore will land on a particular thing, like let's say a rotting log out in the middle of the woods, and a big mushroom will grow. And what that mushroom does is it excretes digestive enzymes onto the wood, and then it absorbs the nutrients as it goes. So basically fungi make it so there's no waste in an environment. Like a big tree that dies, it contains a lot of energy in it, and a lot of energy that most living organisms could not use, could not consume. However, these mushrooms take it and put that energy to good use, and then animals can come along and eat them, or other organisms can come along and eat them. I personally like mushrooms, some mushrooms. You can put them on a salad, you can fry them up. They're pretty good. They are eukaryotes, so they're eukaryotic cells. Most of these fungi are going to be multicellular, meaning they're made of more than one cell, but there are some that are unicellular. And there are some that have parts of their life cycle where they're in either. Like a mushroom is going to be a multicellular organism. It's going to be a big structure. But these mushrooms also have a single-celled phase of their life. They're spores. So basically all these spores go out and they try to find a spot that's good for them to survive. So it'll help them be able to survive a little bit longer. And they'll float around in the air, and then boom, they'll land on a dead log, and they can grow into a brand new mushroom. And then the process will start over again. That mushroom will put out spores. Those spores fly around until they find a good spot, and they're like, I think I can live here. Boom, grow, digest, eat, that kind of stuff. So the cycle just continues. Fungi do have cell walls, and these cell walls are made of chitin. Chitin was the same type of thing that's found in insect exoskeletons. So the exoskeletons of insects and bugs and like crabs. Some examples of a fungi would be just mushrooms, yeast, that kind of stuff. So mushrooms, like I already said, yeast if you're trying to make your bread rise, that like baker's yeast. So those are examples of fungi. Plants, hopefully you guys know a little bit something about plants. Plants are multicellular. They are photosynthetic autotrophs, so they make their own food using the light, using visible light. They are eukaryotes, and they have cell walls. Those cell walls are made of cellulose, a very tough material, and it's very difficult to digest. So for the most part, some organisms aren't going to necessarily eat this. I mean, there's things like cows, and there's obviously animals that just specifically eat only plants. But for us, most plants we can't eat and get any nutritional value out of, at least the cellulose portion of it. However, cellulose is also called fiber, so it will help you move things along in your digestion, if that makes sense. And lastly, we've got Kingdom Animalia. These are going to be multicellular. These are going to be heterotrophic, so they have to eat other things in order to survive and get the energy that they need. They are eukaryotes, and they don't have a cell wall. No cell wall because they have to be able to move. Plants, while that cell wall made of cellulose provides a lot of structural benefits, it also makes it so they can't move very easily. So, yeah, that's where we're at. Just to briefly recap, we had 3 domains. We had the eubacteria, which is like normal bacteria. They have cell walls. They live everywhere. Examples were E. coli, strep throat, staph infections. But there's millions of different species that we probably don't even know about or we could get into. The second are archaeobacteria. They are extremophiles. They live in extreme locations like volcanic hot springs or brine pools, which are really salty pools. Our third domain is domain eukarya. These are eukaryotes. So these are all of the complex living things that exist on planet Earth. In domain eukarya, there are 4 different things. There are fungi, basically the decomposers of the world. Their job is to break down dead things and digest them and recycle that energy and raw material back into the ecosystem. Protists, which they just kind of live everywhere and do their own thing, and they can have characteristics of all the other 3. We've got plantae, which are the plants. We've talked a lot about plants in the past, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. They're green. They make their own food. They have cell walls. And lastly, animals. Animals, they're multicellular. They're heterotrophic, meaning they got to eat. They are eukaryotes, and they do not have cell walls. So that's where we're going to leave it today. Not quite sure. 18 minutes. Perfect. So I'm going to upload this onto YouTube and link it to you guys in the e-learning. All right. See you guys.